Finally, I'm making this video. Greetings, my name is Nina, welcome back to the Metal Book Tavern. A year ago I made a video called Why It's Okay to Stick to Your Favorite Artists. And at the end of that video I mentioned fantasy and metal and that I would talk about them in a separate video. Surprise, surprise! A year later, this video is finally out. Yeah, I know that it took me a year to make this video. That's mostly because I had trouble with the script. I don't know how to address this topic, even though I wanted to do that. Introduction. Fantasy. My favorite genre of literature. Different worlds, memorable characters, lots of magic, lots of adventures, dragons, kings, queens, wizards, elves, gnomes, again dragons, unicorns, fellowships, and so much more. I've always loved fantasy. As 2020 hit, I fell down into the fantasy rabbit hole. His Dark Materials, The First Law, The Kingkiller Chronicle, The Stormlight Archive, Wheel of Time, and so on. Oh, and Chronicles of Narnia too. How could I forget that? And of course, Tolkien stuff. I think that my love for fantasy is obvious. And what else do I like a lot? Metal. One of the reasons I gravitated towards metal back in the early 2010s was that metal did not have your standard pop lyrics. I did not pay much attention what exactly the lyrics were about. As long as the song was good and there were no standard pop lyrics, I was absolutely okay. Then I noticed that quite a lot of metal songs were about elves, dragons, wizards, magic, and so on. So in late 2013, I read the books after I watched the films multiple times, and I did not have access to the books until 2013. I have a separate video about my favorite songs inspired by Tolkien. You can check that one out. It was in 2014. When I completely 100% understood that metal can be about fantasy. Yeah, sure, of course I knew some songs referenced fantasy, but I did not completely understand it until 2014. And now, after listening to quite a lot of metal songs, I can say that there is a connection between fantasy and heavy metal. What do these things have in common? Well, grab some drink, probably tea, or maybe you have some lembas bread out there, or something delicious. Sit down and let's dive deep into the topic. Or maybe you are at the gym and you want to listen to something while working out. I hope this video fits that purpose. In this video, I'm going to go through things that fantasy and metal have in common. You can also listen to this video like a podcast. And if I missed out something, I'm going to add it in audio form. So let's go through this topic. Quick note, however, this video isn't about who inspired who. There's no deep dive into the lyrics themselves. This video is an observation of facts that fantasy and metal have in common. By the way, I have a video about songs that were inspired by books. I have finished script for part 2, and sooner or later this video is going to be made. Is your tea ready? Grab it. We're going on adventure. Interlude. JRR Tolkien. Sure, I mentioned already that this video isn't about who inspired who, but this video wouldn't be complete without mentioning JRR Tolkien in a separate chapter. By the way, prior to filming this video, I came across this video entitled Classic Rock and Tolkien or something like that, and unfortunately don't remember the full title, and the link is in the description. It's about a deep dive into classic rock and Tolkien. Seriously, who hasn't been influenced by Tolkien? I think everybody was. Filmmakers, game makers, writers, and musicians. Also, another person who took inspiration for Tolkien is filming this video and talking. Yes, it's me, you got that right. Basically everybody. I think everybody who is into fantasy these days took inspiration from Tolkien. And speaking about metal, Tolkien has been influenced this genre since basically the very first heavy metal album ever made. I mean Black Sabbath album by Black Sabbath. One of the songs on the album is called The Wizard, not to be confused with The Wizard by Uriah Heep. Those are two different songs. The Black Sabbath song is definitely about Gandalf. When you read the lyrics, you realize that the lyrics are about him. More bands took inspiration from Tolkien, like Led Zeppelin and Rush. By Rush, I absolutely love the song Rivendell. And then, years later, a lot of metal musicians took inspiration from Tolkien. Can be honest with you, I'm not into black metal, even though I listen to it from time to time. I know that there's this band called Summoning that takes inspiration from Tolkien. And for power metal, I can definitely name the infamous Nightfall in Middle-earth by Blind Guardian. Definitely a stellar album. It's entirely based off the Silmarillion. And given how hard it is to read Silmarillion, even if you go through it multiple times, I can say that basing an entire album of that book is a bold move. Very bold. Why is Tolkien so attractive to musicians? Well, I have some speculations about this. Well, first thing that comes to my mind personally, maybe it's not the same thing that comes to your mind at first, but it's definitely what I think of first is epicness. Lord of the Rings has some epic and grandiose moments. Metal music in general is epic and grandiose, and for such music you need some epic and grandiose lyrics. And to get those lyrics you need to take inspiration from something epic and grandiose, I guess. Yeah, Tolkien has a lot of epic battles, and the whole Lord of the Rings books are basically saving the world, and this is definitely something epic, something global, something major. But Tolkien is more than just epicness or something global. His books are quite versatile. They have different tones and themes. His books can focus on things on a global scale or on a minor scale. It can be a story about the entire universe or a group of characters or on simply about one individual. From Beren and Luthien to the Children of Húrin to The Hobbit to the Unfinished Tales and to Fall of Gondolin. They can be fun and uplifting, they can be sad and melancholic, or even dark and scary. Yeah, Tolkien is very versatile, and different aspects inspire different musicians and writers. Okay, I have myself for the later, yeah. You know what else is versatile? Metal music. Metal music also covers various different themes, from starting with battles and ending with the innermost conflicts. Metal songs come in different shapes or forms. Some are more aggressive, some are more lighthearted, some are fast, some are slow, some are more instrumental, the others are focused more on vocals and blah 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 blah. In sound and in lyrics, they are different. Yeah, some songs are more aggressive, some are more relaxed, and most are in between. Metal is divided into multiple subgenres, and each subgenre has its own charm. Even one subgenre has versatile bands that don't sound like the other, and even one band can have albums that don't sound like each other, and even one album can have songs that don't sound like each other. And even one song can have both fast and slow moments. One example of such song for me is Master of Puppets by Metallica, because it has thrashy elements for the first 2 or 3 or 4 minutes, and then there's this slow part. But the main reason musicians love Tolkien, I think, is that Tolkien had a musical spirit himself, and it shows in his books. So his characters are musically gifted, and when you open the Silmarillion, the first thing you learn is that the entire universe was sung into existence. He wrote a lot of poems, added them to his books, and called them songs. And his choice of words is very beautiful. The road goes ever on, and not all those who wander are lost. I think every Tolkien fan knows these words. So now, here is this very nice book called The Letters of Tolkien, whose extended version came out recently as for December 2023. This book has a proof for Tolkien's musical spirit. Allow me to read the extent from the letter 142. Anyone who can play a stringed instrument seems to me a wizard worthy of deep respect. I love music but have no aptitude for it, and the efforts spent on trying to teach me the fiddle in youth have left me only wish, a feeling of awe in the presence of fiddlers. In my humble opinion, Tolkien was a writer who deep inside his heart wanted to be a musician. I can say the same about Hans Christian Andersen due to the nature of his stories, and myself. This is what happens when you begin writing stories as a music nerd. Your books are somehow about music, even if they are technically about something else. Didn't Andersen say, when words fail, music speaks? Given that music tends to unite people, even those who speak different languages, these words are more relevant than ever. Okay, now this interlude is over. Now let's go through 7 chapters, 7 things that fantasy and metal have in common, whether if fantasy is Tolkien or not. Let's go. Chapter 1. Epicness. Like I mentioned earlier, the first thing that comes to mind is epicness. Fantasy is epic in general, and it provides a great lyrical inspiration for metal. Musicians can come up with their own stories, or they can take inspiration from existing fantasy works. Even though I'm not a fan of this band, one example of epicness that comes to my mind is Rhapsody. Let's take the song Dawn of Victory. It's epic in sound and has epic lyrics about swords and demons and dragons. I nearly said about demons and wizards. No. And also there's armor, kings, and so on. Basically a perfect example of combination of fantasy and metal. Or Emerald Sword. Oh, sorry, shouldn't I say Emerald Sword? Also epic in sound and with epic lyrics about kings and swords and mountains and so on. And with the fun pronunciation of the word emerald. One of the few things I know about Rhapsody, well, other than the band name, legal disputes or something, is that their albums tell the whole story called the Emerald Sword Saga. The albums are fantasy focused with dragons on the cover, including The Power of the Dragon Flame, which has my favorite Rhapsody song, The March of the Swordmaster. And it kinda sounds like Blackmore's Nights play minstrel play, and as far as I know, both songs are based on another song. I don't remember which one, unfortunately. Yeah, epic lyrics about epic things for epic songs. Yeah, it is important to mention though that the level of epicness varies from band to band, from author to author. Some books and albums are more epicness driven than others. Which leads us to the next chapter. Next thing that fantasy and metal have in common. Chapter 2. The division into subgenres. I promise you I don't know any other genre that is as deep and developed as metal. Probably rock. But rock and metal basically, well, not the same thing, but close enough. So that doesn't count. Metal is just like one giant tree with a lot of strong branches, and some of those branches have their own branches. In other words, metal is a music genre that is divided into a lot of the subgenres, like I said earlier. Each subgenre has its own traits and features, and you can easily tell them apart, even if some of them are similar to each other. You have heavy metal, you have thrash metal, you have power metal, you have industrial metal, and so so on. Yeah, like I said earlier, some genres are similar to each other, sometimes they overlap. The differences are still there, and even each subgenres, they are also developing into separate subgenres. The same can be said about fantasy. It's also divided into subgenres. You have high fantasy, like Lord of the Rings. It's about epicness, good versus evil, saving the world, the chosen ones, and so on. You also have urban fantasy like Harry Potter and to a smaller extent Chronicles of Narnia. Urban fantasy is at first set in the normal world, but then characters discover a fantasy world and so on. Sometimes urban fantasy is set about the magical things that are still in the normal human world. And also you have dark fantasy like The Witcher, where fantasy is quite horror-like, and some books within the same series manage to be separate genres. Well, take The Dark Tower by Stephen King, for example. Each book is a whole different genre. So the first book, The Gunslinger, is basically a western because Stephen King was inspired by westerns. The third one has some futuristic elements, and the fourth one is fantasy, which is also unfortunately very sappy. If you read the book, you know why. Elements of futuristic dystopia, sci-fi, horror are present throughout the series. Oh, I also forgot to mention that there is this subgenre of fantasy called grimdark, and The First Law by Joe Abercrombie is basically grimdark. It isn't just a dark fantasy, it's about a very dark with all the brutal characters, brutal elements, and so on. Not my type of fantasy, but I really love The First Law. On a surface level, fantasy and metal are just fantasy and metal, but once you dive deep, you learn that they are divided into subgenres, and you easily learn to distinguish the subgenres. Also, I did kinda notice that fantasy and metal also differ from each other based on the authors or the band's geography. Yeah, I think that there's something about the authors or band's geography that affects their work, even if it's something minor. You are going to feel the difference, even if it's small, especially when it comes to metal. There's a lot to say about metal from different parts of the world, but that will take a different video. Unfortunately, I haven't read much fantasy from non-English speaking countries, well, probably except for The Neverending Story by Michael Ende, who was German. It's still, the differences are present. Chapter 2, the division into subgenres. Chapter 3, the variety of themes. Related to the point I made in the interlude about Tolkien, both fantasy and metal are versatile in their themes and their interpretations. Depending on the subgenre or even on a separate work, fantasy and metal may cover certain themes quite more often than others. Wars, society, friendships, growth, ambition, loyalty, struggles, courage, tragedy, freedom, etc. One theme can be interpreted differently in various songs or books. Fantasy and metal come in different shapes and forms, which is one of the reasons it's divided into the subgenres. Also, I noticed an interesting pattern. So, in autumn 2022, I was reading two books around the same time. One was Rhythm of War by Brandon Sanderson. This is the fourth book in the Stormlight Archive series, and the other book was Two Towers by JRR Tolkien, the second book in Lord of the Rings. So, the Rhythm of War came out in 2020 and the Two Towers came out in 1954. So these two books are very different, and reading them at the same time made me realize that fantasy has evolved with time. The deal is that Rhythm of War, being a 21st century fantasy, focused on the themes that the fantasy of previous generations didn't cover much, didn't address at all. One of those themes was mental health, and Rhythm of War didn't just address mental health, it addressed mental health from the perspective of a healer. Yeah, sure, a warrior turned healer with his own struggles. I think the Rhythm of of War is the first book that I read that not only addresses this theme, but also offers a certain interpretation of the said theme. But for me, it's less about what the particular theme is about, or even what the particular interpretation of the theme is about. It's not about that. It's more about the fact that fantasy offers to explore this theme in the first place. This offer proves that there's always a place for evolution in fantasy. There's always a place for certain themes and different interpretations, and this is one of the things that keeps fantasy alive. Take A Song of Ice and Fire / Game of Thrones. Not only the most popular fantasy series / TV show of recent years, but also the series that has popularized the so-called realistic approach to fantasy. I think this is one of the reasons behind the series' popularity, and new approach, even if it isn't perfect by any means. Speaking on the so-called realistic fantasy, there are a lot of uncover about the topic, and also about the topic of more idealistic escapist fantasy, and it would take a separate video, and I'm definitely going to address that topic. Yeah, this video is going to be made. I think by now you notice that I am by any means no fan of the labels such as a realistic fantasy or mature fantasy or whatever, which is ironic because I was very into those labels back in 2017. Things have changed a lot, and I will address this issue in a separate video. Now let's move on. But my point still stands that George R.R. Martin offered a new approach to fantasy, a new perspective on the genre. Refreshing the genre matters. You wouldn't want to recycle the same thing and over and over and over again, would you? At least without adding some new additions. I'm going to discuss this a bit later. Yes, this is the thing about fantasy, and I bet it's the same about metal, isn't it? And so it's autumn 2022. I invest myself in Rhythm of War. What music am I listening to in accordance to that book? Of course, I'm listening to Blind Guardian, particularly their song from their new album, The God Machine, called Violent Shadows, which is inspired by the Stormlight Archive, particularly by Kaladin. Oh, an unpopular opinion, the Wacken Worldwide live version is better than the studio one. Changed my mind. And one fact, before that album came out in September, it was around summer, I saved to my watch later YouTube feed nearly every interview about the album that I could find with the band members. And one thing that I remembered very well, not the direct words, but something along the lines, the whole essence is this. Oh, you know what? The world is changing and so does our music. We are evolving, we are changing as musicians, and the new album has to reflect those changes. Like I said, not the exact words, but I think you got what I want to say here. And that's kinda true. If you listen to their new album and then to their old albums, you are going to hear the difference. The new album is different from their 90s stuff. Sure, there is something that unites all of their albums, but they're different from one another in many ways. Times change, and so does fantasy and metal. Their 90s albums referenced Tolkien and King Arthur. The God Machine references the Kingkiller Chronicle and the Stormlight Archive. Oh, speaking of those two series, I often see them brought out together, and not just by metal musicians. In general, these two walk hand by hand. Rereading The Name of the Wind in summer 2023 made me realize that if I have to choose between the Stormlight Archive and the Kingkiller Chronicle, I am going to side with the latter. It took quite a lot of time to comprehend, to grow into the Stormlight Archive, whereas the Kingkiller Chronicle I loved before I reached page 100. So the first book in English consists of 600 something pages, and before I reached page 100, I was like, I need the second one. And since I read the book in English, I can definitely tell you that Patrick Rothfuss's choice of words is very beautiful. If you follow various different bands, you are going to notice that they evolve with time. this is something that happens to nearly every band. And it isn't just because some bands face lineup changes. In general, bands have a tendency to experiment, to evolve, to search for new things. Isn't this how the whole progressive rock and metal genre was born? Some fans don't like those changes, and that's absolutely fine. In defense of the old fans, I can definitely tell that some changes are kind of wrong. They aren't that great. Yeah, definitely. This, however, doesn't change the fact that evolution is present, and this is what keeps genres alive. The variety of tones and themes and scales is here to stay. Everyone can pick the ones that fit their taste. Chapter 4. They can change your life for the better. Yeah, I know that these words can be applied to nearly every creative work, but it's especially noticeable with fantasy and metal. So I googled why is fantasy so popular, and this is what I found. Allow me to read this to you rather quickly. Writers love the freedom the genre gives them to explore themes and ideas. Readers love the sense of wonder and the assurance that one small person can make a difference. Fantasy fiction does not deny or diminish the existence of sorrow and pain, as so many people seem to think. The possibility of failure is absolutely necessary for the piercing sense of joy one feels when victory is finally and with difficulty won. Fantasy denies ultimate despair. It holds out the hope for a better world and signposts the way. The key word here, in my opinion, is freedom. You know what else is about freedom? Metal! Consider this a shameless self-promotion here, but this is what my own fantasy novel is about. I didn't fully comprehend this while I was writing, but in hindsight, after I finished the novel, I realized that the core theme is freedom. Freedom and music and magic, these are very interesting things to write about. These are the things I would love to write more books about. And these things are one of the reasons I love the Kingkiller Chronicle so much. Also, an unpopular opinion, but as a YouTuber and a writer, well, a creative person in general, I am not afraid of revisiting my old ideas, because each time you do, you can come up with a new interpretation. Yeah, I know I said earlier you wouldn't want to recycle the same ideas over and over again, but if you can come up with a new interpretation, this is not a bad thing. The new interpretation that is different from a previous one. A new interpretation of something old can be much more fresher and more exciting than coming up with a new idea. This is not about cliches that other authors explored. I'm talking about things that you, as a creator, once explored. Well, for example, I once wrote a book about freedom and music and magic and blah 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 blah, things like that, and I'd love to explore these things again from a new perspective. Okay, regardless of band or subgenre, the core theme of metal is freedom. Freedom from social disputes, freedom to have fun, freedom to experiment, freedom to do this, freedom to do that without hurting anyone, blah 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 blah. And there's an aspect of hope too. Hope to overcome obstacles or hope for a positive change. Fantasy and metal, they push your boundaries and make you see things from a different perspective. I can definitely say that A Song of Ice and Fire affected me in many ways. I started to see things differently because of the series. Well, mostly the books, because the books are more well thought out, even compared to the earlier seasons of the show. I'm not saying this because I was extremely obsessed with the series back in the day, but because it offered a lot of interesting perspectives. And not just the whole realistic and mature thing, but because it offered a perspective I've never come across before. Metal also changed me. Well, before I discovered Nightwish, my gateway metal band, I did not consider myself a music person at all, and if I didn't come across metal, I'd still be listening to Shrek and SpongeBob soundtracks. They're quite cool. I'd still listen to them. They're amazing. Yes, I had two very strong obsessions in the last decade, Nightwish and A Song of Ice and Fire. I'd love to talk about these. I'd like to talk about them more in the future. Maybe I should make a separate video. I don't know. Either way, since fantasy and metal, they push your boundaries, give you freedom of thought, they can change your life. You may start thinking differently and then do things you never thought you would do, or do them in a way you never thought you would do. This positive aspect can affect others too. Chapter 5. The Misunderstanding of the Genres. There used to be a time when fantasy and metal had mostly niche appeal. I'll cover the nicheness properly in the next chapter. In this chapter, however, I want to go through the wrongful perception and the wrongful assumptions about fantasy and metal. These are the results of the nicheness, I think. You can argue that when Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter first hit the theaters in 2001, fantasy gained a huge appeal and sparked a lot of other fantasy films, therefore changing the public perception of fantasy for the better. You would be correct. Overall, fantasy has a better reputation these days than it did before 2001. Sure, Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter popularized fantasy. Nonetheless, in some places, fantasy is considered a niche thing to this day. Well, at least if it isn't some kind of a household name like the ones I mentioned here. And of course, there are a lot of wrongful assumptions about fantasy that can be easily debunked once you dive deep.
Oh, fantasy is cheesy. Oh, fantasy is childish. Fantasy isn't deep enough. Fantasy doesn't provide valuable life lessons.
Harry Potter, teaching kids that not all adults have your best interests in heart, and even those who do can still be in the wrong. And there are also some wrongful assumptions about metal as well.
Metal is all satanic. The vocals are all screaming. The band members are scary.
And many other assumptions. Once again, those assumptions can be easily debunked or downplayed. Metal in general is not satanic. Well, take Black Sabbath for example. For them, satanic themes are simply a tool. It's just a part of the show, and so it is so for a lot of other bands. And no, not all metal bands sing about Satan. And no, singing about Satan does not automatically make you satanic. If I go sing a song about smoking cigarettes, does it mean that I am a massive smoker? No, of course. I simply sang a song about cigarettes and it does not mean that I'm a smoker. By the way, I don't smoke at all. I tried a cigarette once with my friend when I was 17. Hated it. Never touched a cigarette ever since. Please don't smoke. Smoking isn't that great. Metal screams are one of the best things about metal. You as a metal vocalist. You are using your voice to a full extent, expressing emotions and sharing that energy with the listeners, especially live. And it takes a lot of skills to scream properly. The third assumption of about metal that I mentioned here, I have to confess that when I was around 14 or 15, I definitely used to think that rock stars were scary looking. I was afraid of them. Now, when I look at most bands, I suddenly realize that most band members are surprisingly very good looking, or even if they look casual. There's something about metal that makes you look good, I think. Now, I'm not going to dive deep into all the wrongful assumptions about both fantasy and metal. This is not what this video is about. My point here is that both fantasy and metal are, or at least they used to be, misinterpreted. misunderstood, in short. The vast majority of people looked down at them at best and considered them evil at worst. Yeah, it's actually quite easy to label fantasy and metal evil instead of actually researching what they are about, but once you come to learn about those things, you learn that they are quite cool. Chapter 6. The exclusiveness from the mainstream. So I mentioned at the beginning of the last chapter about the nicheness. Here I'm going to talk about it. Quick note, this chapter isn't meant to trash the mainstream media. Well, even though mainstream media kinda deserves to be trashed, but that's a whole another story. Once again, this video is about pointing out what fantasy and metal have in common. Well, look at the mainstream media. Which music artists and books is mainstream media promoting? Well, in general, I mean. Well, anything other than metal and fantasy. Even though fantasy gets a much kinder treatment from the media than metal. Media doesn't like metal, I think. Media doesn't like metal, I guess. Always either ignoring metal or downplaying it or whatever. And even if somehow there is a place for fantasy and metal in mainstream media, you are going to notice that only certain subgenres or certain authors or bands or works are going to be mentioned. Well, I already made a podcast called Book Talk Books and the Mainstream, or I forgot the title of my own podcast, and you can go listen to that podcast and my point still stands. I may be making a wrongful assumption here, but I think the main criteria for covering a book in mainstream media is that it's either young adult or it currently has a very popular screen adaptation coming out at the moment, or it's simply Book Talk famous or something. As for metal, I think everybody and their grandma knows Metallica, Rammstein, and Ozzy Osbourne. And also Judas Priest and Iron Maiden. These are the bands / artists that lie on the surface, and if you mention to a regular music listener that you like metal, these are the artists that are going to come to their mind. Well, at least that's what happened to me. Allow me to share my story. Oh yeah, some story time with Nina. In December 2022, I went to an interview for an internship at the TV station. At the interview, I mentioned both of my YouTube channels, and I also said that I liked metal a lot. They knew about Ozzy and Metallica and Rammstein, and they asked me if I like these artists, and I said yes. And this wasn't true, to be honest. The truth is that I'm no fan of Metallica and Ozzy Osbourne, and I only appreciated Rammstein after June 2023. This is when I heard Mein Herz brennt, and that song changed my view of Rammstein. The reason I said that I was a fan of those bands was that because, like I said earlier, these were the bands that were lying on the surface, and it was easier to mention them than to turn the interview into a deep dive into the bands that I was actually a fan of, who don't have the same mainstream appeal. Also, I felt like mentioning these favorites on the interview was like opening my soul to them, and I did not intend to do that. I didn't want to do that. Well, if you meet me in person and we start talking about metal and our favorite bands, I have absolutely zero problems whatsoever talking about my favorite bands and why I enjoy them. But I was not going to do that on an interview. For several reasons. Well, they don't have the Metallica level mainstream appeal. I hold them dear. And also because I felt cornered when I was at the interview. Ironically, I got some of the members of the commission at the interview to subscribe to me. Probably they are watching this. Maybe I shouldn't have said these things. I'm sorry. So a month later, I received a call telling me that I was selected for the internship. So there was this gothic / progressive metal dude who became a mentor to me, a traditional heavy / power metal girl. Apparently, they thought that since we both love rock, we would get along. And we did. Obviously, we knew that metal is much deeper than just rock. We discussed the vast majority of subgenres. a lot. I actually sneaked into his playlist and I saw a lot of rock metal, including Aeron, and also Dream Theater. Yeah, we went through the various subgenres and bands multiple times. And also he's a huge, the charismatic voice and the Floor Jansen fanboy. Really, he's a huge fan of them. I remember that he called Elizabeth, the charismatic voice, his favorite person on the internet. Also, I want to end this chapter by saying that this is very ironic that metal, which is a non-mainstream music genre in its nature, has non-mainstream subgenres and bands within. Yeah, there's place for more underrated things within an underrated thing. Chapter 7. A good coping mechanism. Okay, I don't want this video to be too long, therefore this is the last chapter. It's kinda related to chapter 5. Fact about us as human beings in general. All of us have our own vulnerabilities and worries. Regardless of the scale, our issues can make us feel vulnerable, and we search for ways to cope. We need that little escape from the real world for a while. When we read a book or listen to a song, we forget about our worries for a while. We deal with stress, we recharge our energy and mind. That creative work, whether it's a book or a song or a video game or whatever, makes us feel stronger and more positive about things. If it's a band that still tours and makes albums, you may have the chance to see them live. Oh, this part actually hurts because my favorite bands don't tour Georgia. One of the reasons people like metal is that it allows them to unleash their emotions. There are numerous articles about it, proving that metal is very good. Yeah, finally some positive representation of metal in the media. These articles are all over the place. You can Google the positive outcome of metal and why metal is so good or something like that, and you get the results right away. And if it's an ongoing fantasy series, you may be excited for the next book or film or the season of the show. You may become obsessed with it, you may look up all the fan theories, you may have nothing else on your mind, but that upcoming thing, oh wait, that was me. In early 2016 I had nothing else on my mind but Game of Thrones season 6. It was an upcoming season that year. Either way, fantasy serve as a good coping mechanism. Of course they aren't the only coping mechanisms, but they're definitely among the best ones. And given my previous points, they are more than simply coping mechanisms. My point here remains that fantasy and metal are an escape, and Tolkien confirms this. Fantasy is escapist, and that's its glory. The same can be said about metal. Yeah, especially given that Tolkien had a strong influence on metal. Last but not least, they are, like I mentioned earlier, they are safe coping mechanisms. It's better to be into books and music than into substances and some dangerous activities or companies, isn't it? And even if it's not about dealing with stress or coping with something, fantasy and metal are simply fun. Why not relax and chill with them? Yeah, they're fun, they're uplifting, they unite people, they bring bright emotions, and the outcome in general is positive. The finale. Alright, we have come to an end of this quite a long video. Did not expect it to be that long. I hope you enjoyed my essay. Sure, fantasy is a good lyrical inspiration for metal, yet there's more to unite the two than just the lyrics. And this video shows this. Is there something else I should have added? Did I miss something? Let me know down in the comments. What else do you think connects these two? Let me know down in the comments. See you next time. Goodbye.